270%. It's been ripping us off for years on tariffs for lumber and for dairy products. 250% tariff, which is taking advantage of our farmers. So that's
Canada's dairy system, and this has long been a thorny issue. With France and New Zealand have also complained that Canada limits access to sell its cheeses or butter to Canadian consumers.
Now, this latest tariff threat is also a serious concern in Alberta. Well, energy is our largest export to the United States. Alberta beef and dairy.
$3 billion worth of U.S. dairy vanished almost overnight. In less than 48 hours, hundreds of containers filled with American cheese, butter, and milk were turned away at the Canadian border, sent back like unwanted cargo. The official explanation? Trade rules, tariffs, and quotas. But behind the scenes, it was a political powder keg. Washington was blindsided. U.S. farms were left in chaos. And at the center of it all was a financial strategist whose calculated move sent shockwaves through the heart of American agriculture. That man was Mark Carney. His strategic play hit so hard, even some of Donald Trump's closest allies were scrambling to make sense of it. This wasn't your typical trade dispute. It was a perfect storm. Overproduction, geopolitical brinkmanship, and hardball economics collided in a way that turned everyday supermarket discounts into signs of something much deeper. While shoppers celebrated cheap cheese and milk, U.S. farmers were dumping unsold milk down the drain. Companies were bleeding cash, and the White House had little to say. But as you'll see, one small rejected shipment lit the match. It became the flashpoint that exposed just how fragile the U.S. dairy supply chain really is. Then came the hammer blow. Canada announced crippling tariffs on certain U.S. dairy imports, some soaring beyond 200% and in extreme cases, as high as 300%. In trade terms, that's a commercial death sentence. Those tariffs made American dairy instantly unsellable in the Canadian market. Within just 2 days of enforcement, more than 200 containers of American cheese, worth nearly $3 billion, were denied entry at Canadian ports. The shipments were turned around and sent back to an already oversupplied U.S. market. And this wasn't just surplus. This was premium dairy, products meant for shelves in upscale Canadian stores. Much of it was close to its expiration date. To make matters worse, some of these shipments had already been rejected by other international buyers before even reaching Canada. What had once been premium, export-grade inventory was now at risk of becoming waste. The crisis quickly turned logistical as well as financial. Distributors were desperate, scrambling to offload the products, often at a loss. Back home, retail giants like Walmart, Target, and Kroger were flooded with offers from suppliers eager to unload the returned goods. Shock sale labels appeared almost overnight. Customers thought they were scoring rare deals. In reality, those discounts were symptoms of a collapsing supply chain. A lot of that cheese had been kept in cold storage for months, with some even frozen to extend shelf life. But under U.S. regulations, sellers weren't required to disclose that. So consumers had no idea that what they were buying had already been rejected by foreign markets. Behind those bargains was a harsh truth. The dairy aisle had become the front line of an economic battle. To understand why Canada responded so forcefully, we need to rewind to the 1960s. That's when Canada implemented its supply management system for dairy, poultry, and eggs, a model that tightly controls domestic production through quotas and slaps high tariffs on imports beyond agreed limits. The goal: stable prices for consumers and predictable incomes for farmers. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, the U.S. is allowed to export up to 3.6% of Canada's dairy market duty-free. But once that quota is exceeded, steep penalties kick in, and they're designed to discourage over-exporting. In mid-2025, the U.S. breached that limit. Ottawa's response was swift and unyielding. The highest possible tariffs were imposed on over-quota imports, and Canada also reduced future tariff rate quota allocations. The impact was immediate. Hundreds of containers filled with American cheese, butter, milk, and other dairy products were stopped at the border, denied entry, and sent back. Exporters, now staring at massive losses, scrambled to rebrand the products to sell them domestically. but the sudden flood of supply pushed prices down, forcing retailers to sell at or below cost. The problem was especially acute for specialty products, artisan cheeses from Wisconsin, aged varieties from California, and limited edition batches created for high-profile campaigns. These weren't bulk commodities. They were meant for high-end markets where freshness and exclusivity are everything. Once returned and rerouted, their value collapsed. According to the International Dairy Foods Association, tariffs like these can wipe out tens of millions of dollars in value per shipment when you factor in losses from production, shipping, storage, and markdowns. The impact on farmers was devastating. In major dairy-producing states like Wisconsin and California, milk was left with nowhere to go. Processing plants were already running at full capacity, and without buyers, many farmers were forced to dump milk directly into wastewater systems, a heartbreaking and costly move. Wisconsin alone, which had around 7,000 dairy farms in 2020, saw hundreds more close in the months that followed. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. For many, it became a battle for survival. Family farms, generations old, pushed to the brink. Here's the twist. The very first shipment to be blocked wasn't bulk cheese or milk powder. It was a curated selection of premium cheeses, carefully crafted for a major Canadian retail debut. The rollout had been timed for peak summer tourism, with big marketing campaigns and shelf space already secured in top stores. When the tariffs hit, the launch was dead on arrival. Everything fell apart. It wasn't just a financial loss, it was a major public embarrassment. The producers lost credibility, brand momentum vanished, and the entire incident served as a stark reminder. In the fragile world of international trade, even the best-laid plans can collapse in a heartbeat. In the days that followed, American distributors scrambled to reroute the rejected premium dairy shipments into domestic retail channels. But luxury cheeses don't exactly thrive in the discount aisle. Products designed to be displayed in elegant packaging under carefully controlled conditions were now sitting under harsh fluorescent lights in supermarkets, sold at a fraction of their intended price. Delicate varieties, like triple cream bries and imported-style blue cheeses, quickly deteriorated in these unsuitable conditions. What had once been marketed as gourmet indulgences were now treated like overstock clearance, stripping away their prestige and their profitability. The symbolic damage to brand identity was nearly as severe as the financial loss. Meanwhile, Canadian consumers noticed little to no change in their local dairy sections. Canada's supply management system ensures that domestic demand is met almost entirely by Canadian producers operating under strict quality controls. Milk is routinely tested for antibiotic residues. Synthetic growth hormones like recombinant bovine somatotropin are banned, and each shipment is traceable back to its farm of origin. In provinces like Quebec and Ontario, these measures are more than just regulatory. They're cultural touchstones. They help reinforce public trust in the food system. This stood in stark contrast to the uncertainty surrounding the rejected US products, which only deepened the divide. In the United States, there are no equivalent federal requirements for full traceability in dairy products, and labeling laws don't require retailers to disclose if items were previously rejected from international markets. Because of that regulatory gap, consumers had no way of knowing that the bargain bin cheese they were buying might have been in transit for months or nearing expiration. Retailers used the influx of discounted goods to attract price-sensitive shoppers, but beneath the surface, they were also absorbing massive losses caused by the broader price collapse. For a brief moment, the flood of cheap dairy products drove more foot traffic into stores, but it didn't solve the larger problem. The entire dairy supply chain was buckling under pressure. Cold storage facilities overflowed, forcing companies to rent extra space at rapidly increasing rates. Transportation costs surged as shipments were rerouted or held longer than expected. Trusted brands like Land O'Lakes and Kraft faced the difficult task of offloading excess stock without damaging consumer confidence. The National Milk Producers Federation, a major industry group, issued a warning in mid-2025. Cumulative losses from retaliatory tariffs imposed by Canada and Mexico, combined with rising logistics costs, had already reached $7 billion. By then, it wasn't just about short-term earnings. it was about the long-term survival of the American dairy industry. Calls for government intervention grew louder. Industry boards sent formal appeals to the White House, asking for emergency financial relief and diplomatic efforts to reduce trade tensions. But the federal response remained vague, filled with generic statements about ongoing discussions and exploring options. On the ground, that meant no immediate help for dairy farmers dumping unsold milk down the drain. No subsidies for processors watching their order books evaporate. No plan to stabilize retail prices. This lack of clear leadership left the industry exposed to further shocks, including new trade disputes beyond North America. And that next shock came sooner than anyone expected. The European Union, Japan, and Australia began reviewing their import policies on US dairy, raising concerns about potential surplus dumping. The European Commission even placed more than $72 billion worth of American exports, including cheese, on a preliminary list for possible retaliatory tariffs. This signaled that the crisis was spreading. The US was no longer just clashing with Canada. It was now facing the risk of broader trade isolation from key global partners. For exporters still reeling from the Canadian fallout, the idea of further market closures was alarming. Yet, to the average American shopper, everything seemed fine. Cheese remained plentiful in stores, often at enticingly low prices. Most consumers had no idea that the products in front of them had been rejected abroad or were part of a larger trade dispute. The only visible clue was that certain brands were appearing more frequently in clearance sections. Behind the scenes, though, the consequences were piling up. Dairy processors began laying off workers. Trucking companies reduced routes. Small-town economies that depend on agriculture started to feel the pinch. The low prices at the register came at a steep, invisible cost. One paid not just in dollars, but in livelihoods. For Canadian farmers, the episode reaffirmed the strength of their supply management system. By keeping a tight grip on production and shielding their domestic market from foreign oversupply, they maintained steady incomes and avoided the price crash devastating US producers. Critics of supply management often argue that it keeps prices artificially high for consumers, but supporters counter that it protects quality, ensures traceability, and makes farming sustainable. In the context of this crisis, that argument gained traction. Canada's dairy sector remained stable, while its neighbor's system was spinning out of control. Back in Washington, policymakers began questioning whether the push to exceed Canada's export quota had been a strategic misstep. Yes, it might have brought short-term gains, but it also triggered the very penalties the system was designed to prevent. Economists pointed out that these rules weren't new. They had been part of trade agreements for years. Failing to account for them in US export planning either reflected a serious oversight or a risky bet that Canada wouldn't enforce its rights. If it was a gamble, the result was clear. Canada called the bluff, and the US dairy industry paid the price. As the year wore on, a combination of surplus, falling prices, and uncertain trade relationships forced many in the industry to face hard decisions about their future. In the aftermath of the tariff fallout, some farmers made the tough choice to scale back production, even selling off portions of their herds to reduce costs. Others pivoted toward niche markets, focusing on organic or specialty dairy products that were less vulnerable to the volatile swings of bulk pricing. But these solutions offered relief to only a small fraction of the industry. For the majority, the deeper challenges, overproduction, rising operational costs, and unreliable export markets, remained unresolved. With no unified national response in sight, fears of a slow and steady contraction of the US dairy industry began to take hold. By the time autumn 2025 rolled around, the initial shock of Canada's tariffs had mostly disappeared from the news cycle, overtaken by other political and economic developments. But in America's rural heartland, the crisis was still very real. Families who had worked the same farmland for generations were beginning to question whether planting another season was even worth the risk. Banks grew more cautious, tightening lending criteria as they assessed the growing instability in the sector. Local economies that depend on agriculture, equipment dealers, feed stores, repair shops, started to feel the slowdown. What had once seemed like an abstract policy dispute was now deeply embedded in the economic reality of small towns across the country. And still, much of the rejected cheese remained in circulation. Some of it found new destinations, schools, prisons, and food banks, where quality standards differ from those of retail outlets. While this helped prevent waste, it also meant that products originally crafted for high-end international shelves were now being served in institutional settings. For many producers, this outcome was deeply disheartening. The same premium cheeses they had worked hard to promote abroad, as luxury imports were now being consumed domestically at the lowest possible price point. The impact on brand reputation was difficult to measure, but its consequences could stretch well into the future. Economists pointed to a larger takeaway: the extreme fragility of globally interconnected markets. One policy decision in Ottawa, enforcing trade rules that had been on the books for years, triggered a cascading crisis throughout the North American dairy industry. Every link in the chain, from farmers to consumers, was affected. And while the immediate trigger was a tariff, the root problems were homegrown: an overdependence on exports, a lack of contingency planning at the national level, and limited transparency for consumers. These are issues that no trade renegotiation alone can solve. Fixing them would require a complete rethinking of how the U.S. dairy industry functions. By year's end, the conversation in Washington had finally started shifting toward long-term resilience. Some lawmakers proposed investments in domestic dairy processing infrastructure, allowing surplus milk to be converted into products with longer shelf lives. Others pushed for clearer labeling laws, so consumers would know more about where their dairy came from, and whether it had been previously rejected by foreign markets. But progress was slow. For the farmers and processors already forced out of business, those conversations offered little comfort. While the trade dispute with Canada may have lit the spark, the fire it started revealed just how deeply the industry needs reform. Looking back, this episode highlighted a fundamental paradox of global trade. Markets may span the world, but they can still be perilously narrow. One misjudged export, one missed signal, or one underestimated trading partner can wipe out billions in value virtually overnight. For American dairy, the summer of 2025 won't just be remembered for the financial losses. It will be remembered for the hard questions it raised, about policy, about transparency, and about how to balance bold ambition with cautious pragmatism in international commerce. And for those who lived through it, whether farmers, distributors, or even shoppers chasing discounted cheese, the experience won't soon be forgotten. Long after the headlines fade, this will remain a cautionary tale about what happens when the ground beneath an industry suddenly shifts. Please subscribe to the Timefold channel and don't forget to like.